Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to, I think, what is the penultimate session. So by now, I imagine you're all feeling really high energy, ready for some complex ideas. Wow, that response was underwhelming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about narratives and stories. They are different things. We will come to that. I'm going to talk about managerialism, and I'm going to talk about agility. I am probably going to rant a little bit about managerialism, but that's kind of who I am. In the course of this talk, there are a couple of big ideas which the feedback I've had before said, oh, you need to get rid of those words, they're too big, right? But the problem was when I got rid of those words, it didn't make sense. So you're just going to have to bear with me. I will introduce the words. Please be nice to me. I'm going to try and explain what I mean. Okay. So let's go. Is this going to work? Of course it's not. Why would technology work when I need it to? No? Right, well, there we go. One of the bits of feedback I got before the event was that I needed to signpost my talk a bit more. So I took that maliciously literally, and so here is the signpost. That's the sort of structure. You'll know where we are because of the arm that's pointing where we're at. So managerialism isn't just management, right? So managerialism is all those things that we sort of hate about work. Prince 2, bureaucracy. This is the way we do things. The fact that hotels, hospitals, government departments, economies, charities, your insurance company, factories are all the same, and we can just use the same tools to run all of them, right? That's managerialism, because what you've got is you have got managerialism, an equation, that makes everything clear, right? Managerialism equals management. That's the technology that we all use every day and day. By technology here, I mean applied knowledge, right? So applied knowledge of management plus expansion, because management now run everything. Plus, and I have to remember what the word I'm looking for here is, ideology. And that's actually the key to this. Managerialism is an ideology which effectively has overtaken huge parts of the world. And here's the downside of this. It is fundamentally anti-democratic, right? What it's trying to do is take over so that you don't have to think about doing anything, okay? So, managerialism, sort of in my position, broadly not good. Okay. Oh, and now that's not working either, so that's good. Right, moving on, see? David Boje is a retired professor of management at the University of New Mexico. And his work was on narratives and stories in organisations. And in his 2008 book, Storytelling Organisations, he introduced a topology of storytelling and narratives, okay? Now, I've sort of broken this into two parts because it's a bit much to give at once. But here's the horizontal. It represents time, yeah? So over here, we have the past, and we're moving forward in a very literal metaphor towards the future, okay? But you'll notice I haven't said past, present, and future. I've said pasts, presents, and futures, because every single one of us have experienced a different past. Even if we were in the same team, the same organisation, the same country, all of those pasts are fundamentally different. The presents we're all experiencing at this very moment are fundamentally different. Some of you are thinking, oh God, that David's droning on a bit. It's nearly time to go home though, so I'll cope. Some of you are like, oh wow, David's amazing, and I will pay you your tenors afterwards. The futures are unmade. We still have to stitch those futures together. So they could diverge wildly. You know, maybe we go to a Star Trek future, maybe we go to a Dune future. Okay? I don't know which it's going to be. I'm hoping for Star Trek, but, you know, I'm not always lucky. I will introduce the vertical later on, but it will pivot around presence, okay? So that's your anchor point. So the first question really is, what's the difference between a narrative and a story? Okay? Most people think of narratives and stories as being synonyms, right? They're two different words that basically mean the same thing. Oh, I've got somebody shaking their head. You are the one exception in this room, I think. Okay? I think they're more like homonyms, in the sense they sort of sound the same. I mean, they literally don't, but this is a metaphor, right? They sort of sound the same, but actually they have fundamentally different characteristics. So the takeaway for narratives versus stories is that narratives are centripetal, right? So they're controlling. They want everything to come to the center where there is a single control point. This has the effect of being deviation reducing. So this is a negative feedback loop, right? We have a thermostat in this room. God knows it's not a very good thermostat, but we do have a thermostat. And what that's doing is monitoring the temperature and then doing absolutely nothing about it. But if it was a good thermostat, it would be going, stop pumping out heat, make it cooler, right? And eventually you would have a homeostatic state of around, well, in this room, about 37 degrees, I think. On the other hand, you have stories. Stories are centrifugal. They want to throw things away from the center. They want to create new things. So this is a positive feedback loop. Now, they don't happen a huge amount in nature. I mean, global climate change is a fantastic, if terrible, example of a positive feedback loop, where the things getting worse just keep making things get worse. So that's cheerful. But what it also does is it allows you to change in response to the environment. Who's heard of the law of requisite variety from systems thinking? One of you? Okay, so basically what that says is your system has to have enough variety in it to respond to the variety outside in the environment. If you don't have that variety, you will fail to meet its needs. Okay, so if your car company only sells black cars, yes, I'm looking at the Henry Ford who never really existed, then you're never going to satisfy the needs of people who want red cars, for example. So that's the difference between narratives and story. One is centrifugal, one is centripetal. Guess where we are going next? So in that little horizontal chart I showed you, there were two colours, right? There was pink and blue, narrative ways and story ways. So a narrative is, generally speaking, consisting of what we call the Aristotelian elements of narrative. So if you were in the talk next door with Helen and Helen a few minutes ago, they were talking a lot about stories. They might have mentioned, I don't actually know because I wasn't there, but they might have mentioned things like plot, character, theme, dialogue, rhythm, spectacle, and frame. They might have mentioned that. I don't know whether they did. So narratives tend to be centripetal. They're minimizing that variation, and they're generally looking for narrative coherence. You want a story that sort of reinforces itself. The narrative has to make sense. So it's generally considered to be a whole thing. It tends to be finished. It tends to be globally applicable. And it tends to be complete. Stories are generally retrospective, right? You're always telling a story about the past. You do, and I'll come to that in a second, tell stories about the future. But generally, they're stories about the past. So it's about sense-making what happened. And even when we're talking about prospective storytelling, we're actually making sense of the past and how we project that into the future. So I was at a talk about automotive engineering yesterday afternoon. It's like, we have always done this sort of car in the past. How do we continue doing that in the future? Which may or may not be a good response to the situation you're in. So typically, narratives are monological. There is one strand of thought that dominates all others. They're univocal, so there is one voice that's speaking. And they're monocentric, so there's just one center of control. In organisation, there's three sorts of narratives that you can come across. The first is a BME narrative. That stands for beginning, middle, end. Anybody recognise the picture? Star Wars. Therefore, you all know what a beginning, middle, end story is, right? So Typically they're linear, so this is your hero walking through a strange land. Think an Odyssey, for example, and what happens in that strange land reveals the character of that hero. The character is not changed. Luke Skywalker's character doesn't change from the start of the film to the end of the film. He just realizes who he really is. Okay? The other type of story you see as a BME is a cyclic, so that's the hero's journey on which Star Wars is somewhat famously based. How do organisations use BMEs? Well, who can think of an origin story for an organisation they currently or have previously worked in? Now, I would love to tell you, come and talk to me afterwards when I'm not on camera, and I'll tell you a really good example of this. But typically, your origin stories create a version of the truth that nobody will question. And what that does is it controls not only how you talk about the past, but what is acceptable to talk about as well. So, it constrains people and controls people. Then we have fragments. I originally had jigsaw pieces for this, but the problem with fragments is you're sort of digging up an archaeological dig, and it might be from 20 different pots. Okay. Now, David, what is a fragment? I can see some of you thinking you should probably have started with that. If you were working for someone like Nike and somebody said, well, we don't want another sweatshop incident. Oh yeah, several people pulled quite dramatic faces when I said that. Right, you got the entire point of my story there, and I said about 6 words, something like that. Okay, that is a terse story fragment. You tell the entire story, and what that does is it places controls about what's happening. So it's often a caution. An example of something I think will become a story fragment quite quickly is a story about the chief executive has just been appointed. He's been there for like 3 months. One day he walks into the boardroom and he throws down on a table a sign that says executive parking only and says, this is not who we are, right? That will rapidly become the throwing the sign on the table incident, and people won't talk about it. Those of you who do like Star Trek, if I say Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra, anybody get that? One person, thank you very much. I love you, Helen. The rest of you who don't, it's a society that is based purely on metaphor. So that represents a point at which 2 people became friends, and that is how they talk about situations where people become friends. They just refer to the incident. Okay, a modern example of this would be just having an entire communication in memes. Okay, if you're doing that, this is what you're doing. It's a terse fragment. How do we use those in organisations? Clearly, it's creating moments of control, right? It's, we don't want to do that because it's a challenge to who we are. Anti-narrative. No, not anti-narrative, anti-narrative. So this is where you're placing a bet, anti, on the future, anti, before it happens, yeah? So you're placing a bet on what's about to happen. Now, we all know this because this is strategy stories. In 6 months' time, this will be important to us, so we need to focus on it now, okay? And what that's doing is potentially constraining you and the way you're thinking about what you're going to do next. So when people say you need to make sure that your strategy is aligning with your actions, this is what they're talking about, right? You have told a story, and now you need to make sure that you are telling that story. Managerialism loves narratives, and I think you can see why. A story doesn't really have a beginning or an end yet. It sort of happens in the middle. It's something you're making sense of as you go about it. It seeks to explore the local context, and everybody will have a slightly different perspective of what that story is. So it doesn't have all of those narrative elements. So, for example, implotment hasn't happened yet, so it doesn't have a plot yet. There's just some elements that are coming together. It's beginning to emerge. And stories are typically polylogical. So there are lots of strands to it. Oh, but this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. It's polyvocal, or polyphonic, if you want like a really fancy word for it. But it just means that lots of voices are heard in equal. And then finally, it is polycentric, which might mean that there's multiple points of control in it, which are actually vying for some form of control. So 3 story ways. The first is simultaneities. There's a play in Los Angeles which has been running for years. It's called Tamara. Has anybody heard of it? You're cheating because I told you this the other night. So Tamara, it takes place in a house, and there are 12 rooms in this house. You go in, and there are 12 characters, and they act a scene out, and then they disperse off to the 12 rooms in the house. And you, as an audience, follow those characters as the play unfolds. Now, and I wrote this number down because it's quite important. Because there are 12 rooms and 12 characters, I think you can do a 12 factorial to work out how many possible combinations. Anybody know that number off the top of their head? Sorry? No, but nice try. You were going for 12. No, this is 12 factorial. So it's actually 479 million something. Okay? That's a lot of possible stories. You cannot possibly know what happens in the entire play without talking to people who had followed every single strand of the story and got what was going on. Now, how many meetings does your organisation have a day? Out of interest. Just a guess. Okay? More than 12 probably? How many people are in your organisation? For most of you, that will be more than 12. I'm not going to do the maths, not least because, 479 million is enough to make my point, right? You cannot possibly know all of the stories that are unfolding in your organisation all the time. Some of those will be constrained by narrative, and some of those will be anti-narrative, like they'll be going fully against it. Embodied stories. Do you ever have that moment when you walk into a team, possibly for the first time, and you recognise the pattern that is happening there? And go, we need to... Okay, there's a few of you nodding, that's good. Some people think of this as being like sea sense, so sailors have that sense of they can tell what the sea is going to be like today because they can observe the signs. How many people have had a boss who have boasted about their amazing business sense? Oh yeah, more than you would like. The idea here is that there's a gut feeling that you get when you walk into a context because you've shared that story with other people before. There's an ambulance there, because I used to work on ambulances, and we were called to a gentleman who had fainted on a boat and couldn't get off the boat, okay? Which sounded pretty typical. We just took a normal... So the response kit has got a full resus kit in it anyway, right? So, because we just assume everybody is going to collapse on us at some point, so you might as well be prepared for it. You get there, and my colleague and I looked at each other and we were like, And he got on the phone to the fire and rescue service because he knew there was no way we were getting him off on our own, and we might as well have some handy men to do that for us. And I went for the slightly more advanced drug pack because I was fairly certain this person, and we'd seen this before, was having a really quite serious heart condition moment. And we needed to take this a bit more seriously than we'd led to believe it was. We were right, depressingly, but he got to hospital and he was fine, so that's good. But what happened there was we literally just looked at each other and we effectively told each other a story just with our glance, and we were able to adapt to the situation. And then, any second now, the emotive ethical. Now, you don't have to be out of work for this, but has anybody watched daytime TV with those adverts? Little Jenny is a donkey who has to walk 47,000 miles every day just for a sip of contaminated water. You can help by paying £50 million a month to help Jenny the donkey, right? That's an emotive ethical moment, right? It's created an emotional moment for you, and you're going, oh yeah, I'll pay them £40 million, right? That's what we're trying to do here when people are using this technique. Now, sometimes this is emotional blackmail, right? But sometimes it's sort of the opposite of that, actually. It's when a team realizes there's something they can do to help out and they sort of leap to it. What was my note here? I don't want to miss this one. So emotional recognition leads to ethical action. Oh, does anybody here, and I suspect it's maybe you, but just you, thank you, no thank you, Remember Head, Hearts, Guts and Groin, which was a talk I did 5 years ago, which sounds more shocking than it actually is. And it's available on the internet for all people who want to watch it. But it was basically about how do you communicate with different centres of your body. That refers to this emotive ethical response. Actors use it all the time. Managerialism hates stories. They tend to be emergent, so they're simultaneous, happening in the moment and not controlled. They form a web with repeating patterns that happens across the web, and they're dispersing across the organisation, so they're out of control. They're improvisational. Every telling results in them being retold and reinvented by the people who are telling them. They're open-ended, just waiting for you to put your interpretation on them, and there's lots of people and perspectives represented in there. It's not just one monolithic idea. So, pseudo-dialogue, right? Most dialogue in organisations is actually pseudo-dialogue, okay? So instead of it being an opportunity to listen to each other, it's actually an opportunity for you to listen to me and come to an agreement that I'm correct. Okay? And we'll call that consensus, because that's what we do, right? We're consensus building, which means I'm right and you need to listen to me. Okay? Now, granted, that might be a bit cynical of me. I'm not sure it is, but it might be. There's also that thing when you're sitting in a room and you can hear two people talking, but it's like they're reading the same script. Or the boss has said something. He's the hippo in the room, right? He said something, and now everybody's basically improvising around what he said, trying to work out what the correct thing to say is, right? That's pseudo-dialogue. All of those is where it sounds like more than one person is speaking, but actually there's just one voice going on. So if we go up, so remember I said this was the pivot point, we've gone up and we've gone down. To the down, we have dialectics. I will explain these words in a second. And to the up, we have dialogisms. Going down allows us to be more reflexive, to respond to the things that are happening in the moment. Going up allows us to transcend beyond the things that are happening in the moment and to listen to the diversity that is in the room. So dialectics are a debate which is held in tension. So typically there are 2 points of view, neither one of which is entirely wrong or right. And classically in philosophy, it's done by questions and answers to elicit what the truths and what the falsehoods are, right? So dialectics are a way in which you can recognize there are tensions within the truth, okay? Every organization has them. And here are some classic examples. Sameness versus difference. Who knows that Ronald McDonald lost several pounds in 2004? Right? He lost it because people were complaining about McDonald's misleading people about the nutritional content of theirs, and he mysteriously became a children's fitness coach at the same time. But Ronald McDonald has been the same for all time, right? We all remember him being the same. Okay? That's a thing that they have manipulated quite carefully to maintain this sameness whilst creating difference. Socialization, I-ness versus we's. This is about authenticity. We internalize other people's voices as part of socialization. And as a result of that, when we try to express ourselves, what we're actually doing is filtering everything we're saying through those other people's voices. When people come to us coaches and therapists, for those of you who have been to therapists, very often they're seeking authenticity in what they're doing. And really what they're trying to do is express their I-ness against the we's that are controlling them. That happens in organizations and teams as well. Then there's intuition and mixed purposes as well, like product owners, developers, and quality assurance engineers all have slightly different agendas, right? And actually those purposes are all valid. Dialogism is true dialogue, but it's not just where you're trying to come to the truth, it's where all of those voices are valued and heard at the same time. So I've got some examples of those, but the key thing to remember here is you're never reducing this to a single voice, it becomes symphonic, so you can hear the horns and the strings and the piano all at the same time and it sounds harmonious, not that they're in conflict with each other. So you can hear many voices, you can see different styles. For example, crazy idea, what if somebody was using both spoken word and images and words at the same time in order to convey their message? That would be crazy, right? But that's an example of mixed styles. Mixed cadences and locales, doesn't matter if you've got all your teams working on the same sprint cycles, they still have different senses of time within those teams. And many discourses. We all do this cognitive discussion thing, so like, oh yeah, we should do this because, but there's also an aesthetic and an ethical aspect that we should consider, because those are the things that move us from this is how it is to this is how it should be. And if we're not having those conversations, we're not hearing the full discourse. So that's the whole chart, and you can see that the dialogisms and dialectics allow us to make bets about what's going to work with the stories and narratives. I'll put this up at the end, but there's actually a download of this chart available to make your life, because you'll all remember this, I'm sure. What about agility? Now, I will point out I spent a lot of time not choosing inappropriate rugby player photos here, which was terrible because I had to look at a lot of photos to choose one that worked. So, is agility anti-managerial? I would say it is, but everything before the but is kind of bullshit, but you know, we'll go with it. So broadly, agility is opposed to centralizing control. It's quite centrifugal. It wants to change things up. It's got a dispersing element about it. However, agility can be co-opted by managerialism, right? Now, I'm sure some of you can think of, I don't know, some kind of agile framework that actually is more about control than liberating people. No? Anyway, just an idea. That might be an influence of managerialism, right? But does this create chaos? No, because I think you all know I'm about to say it depends, right? Sometimes you need control, sometimes you need emergence. So in fact, what we have with managerialism, it becomes a dialectic with agility, or at least agility becomes a dialectic, where we've got a tension between them. They're never going to be purely resolved, and we need to respect both parts of that equation. Just wrapping up, anybody recognize this picture? One person, fantastic. You're all heathens. The nature of agility is that we're never really walking in the white or the black. We're never in the light or the dark, right? We're between the two. We should be comfortable in the grey, where it's not clear what correct and wrong is. And we should actually be comfortable in that position, right? If it's all white or all black, that's called fascism, and most people think that's bad, right? So if you're in a situation where all the decisions are made for you, there's no democracy happening, you're not creating your own world. So we can do different modes of deliberation to take our stories and turn them into more things. We want to create control, we'll have pseudo-dialogues, we'll create false listening events where we just listen. And what we'll do is we'll split out dialogue from debate by saying, oh, it's positive-only dialogue, you can only say good things, you can't discuss with people, right? So that's another option. You can have actual debates, but your aim there is still to create control. You can have dialectics, where you actually explore possibilities and use that to reflect on the values you're using to make decisions in the moment. Or, if you want to transcend, you can use dialogisms to create that. So, if I can, I think I've got about 60 seconds left, right? So, what can we do? First, note when you hear an emergent story. Something's happening in a team. I want to hear that thing. What is going on? Okay? How can you carry that out? Story listening is a skill as much as storytelling. Most of us are quite practiced at storytelling. Not many of us are practiced at story listening. And for the last century, people have been opining that people have lost the skill of story listening. Is this going to work? Question control narratives. If you see a narrative prison being erected, tear down the walls, right? That's the simple short version of this. But they do have a time and a place. Just make sure you're questioning them. Explore anti-narratives. If you hear a future, are they telling you this is what the future will be? Or are they saying this is our general direction, now work out how you're going to get there? This is sort of a true north concept. Be centrifugal. Like, throw out ideas that take things away from the centre. Stimulate reflexivity. Get people to reflect on the ideas that are going on within their discussions. And promote transcendence by listening to the complexity of the discourses, the voices, the styles that are being used when people are creating these emergent stories. Thank you very much. This is Waffle. That's the handout. That's me on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.